are coming in. Everybody is really welcome to this panel discussion. My name is Anne Scott. I'm the Vice President for Equality and Diversity here in NUI Galway, and I'm particularly grateful to my colleague Pádraig Mac Neela, who actually co-chairs our Consent Framework Implementation Working Group, for agreeing to lead and facilitate this panel discussion. And of course, really grateful also to Professor Jason Last and Dr Sinéad Ring for joining us. And Pádraig will do some further introductions of our panelists and their areas of interest in a moment. As I said, this is the part of our International Women's Week programme, and I would certainly encourage you to pop into the other sessions that are following on Thursday and Friday of this week. Thank you for making time for joining us this morning, and I'm just going to give a brief introduction to our colleague Pádraig Mac Neela, and he will then take over from me. So Pádraig is a senior lecturer, as most of us in NUI Galway would be aware. He's a senior lecturer in the School of Psychology and has worked in NUI Galway since 2004. My own contact with Pádraig goes back a little further because he worked with me in DCU when I joined the school as head of school in 2000. So we had 4 years together, and I still would say Pádraig is one of the best academics I've worked with. So it's great to be working with him again in NUI Galway. He currently leads the Smart Consent Project and the Active Consent Programme. And his area of research interest is now mainly in youth research, especially in relation to sexual health, mental health, and alcohol use. And I guess he began working in the sexual health area following a project with RCNI in 2013, and he has also served on the Board of Management of the Galway Rape Crisis Centre. I think really, without further ado, I will hand over to Pádraig because I'm aware that our time is very limited this morning and we're here to hear from our panellists. So Pádraig, over to you.
Thanks very much, Anne, and thanks to yourself as Vice President for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion, and also to Niamh Gallagher on the administration side in your office for organising today. It's great to hear I'm still up there on the league table of people you've worked with, so I'm pleased to hear that. Very briefly, I just want to introduce the 2 colleagues who've joined us today for the seminar. So we're going to start in a few moments with Dr Sinéad Ring. The format for today will be some brief presentations and thoughts in response to a series of very challenging questions that we put out. So it's great that they agreed to take part before we sent them the questions. And so Sinead is at the Department of Law at Maynooth University and joined in 2019 from Kent Law School, where she was a senior lecturer there and co-director of graduate studies. She's also taught at NUI Galway and UCC, and visiting positions at Harvard Law School, Melbourne Law School, and University of Technology in Sydney, and has a legal research background as well. I'm very pleased to welcome Sinead, and also Professor Jason Last. So Jason is Dean of Students at UCD, where he's served in that position since January 2017. He's a medical graduate and has responsibility for the student experience at UCD, and is very committed to enhancement of all the UCD programs and the environment to support all students there. I began teaching in UCD School of Medicine in 2000, was Director of Preclinical Education there from 2008, and has been Associate Dean for Programs in Educational Innovation, and has an extensive research background and helped develop the UCD student mental health and well-being policy as well. So great company to be in. And so I've asked the colleagues with Anne then to prepare about 8 minutes just on their responses and their thoughts. And very briefly, the context for that is the so-called consent framework. As you know, it's got a much longer official name. So that sets a number of challenges for colleges and for the sector as a whole. And really, we're working through all the implications and learning what implementation of the consent framework might entail, both in terms of, meeting the targets and then maybe using it as a stepping stone to see how we can really push the boundaries of what colleges can do in this regard. There's a lot asked of us in that framework. So For example, it talks about ending sexual misconduct. It also talks about supporting a positive culture of consent. And colleges haven't necessarily had a tradition of this type of work, or indeed, work that's mainstreamed into people's curricula in any of these areas: mental health, sexual health, etc. So that was the context for them. And I've asked them in particular to think about, and for yourselves to think about for questions, what are the reasonable boundaries of responsibility for a college with respect to student welfare, on campus, off campus? If we look at the reasonable boundaries, do they coincide with what we ought to be doing? In other words, can we push it even further in terms of prevention, promotion, protection? Is it the business of the college? What challenges are involved there? How feasible is it, and how can we make it sustainable to engage academics and HEI leadership to achieve mainstream programming and education? This is a complex business, it's innovative. I'm sure people don't like to see us coming sometimes because of the challenges that arise. Where are the untapped opportunities as yet that we haven't linked in with? What are the most difficult issues that we face to make continued progress? And another one that's come up over the past number of months has been in terms of staff playing a more leading role in these activities, and also staff experience of harassment and sexual violence as well. So those were the slightly head-wrecking terms of reference for the presentations. So we're looking at 8 minutes or so from Sinead, then over to Jason, then to myself, and then try to leave as much time as possible for discussion and questions. And Anne?
Apologies, Pádraig, I won't make it a habit of asking questions before you start, but I did omit to let people know that we were recording the session so that we would be able to let other people who couldn't attend. And just to alert you, there's a little bit of noise interference. It may be to do with the mic or paper or something, but just be aware that we may need to come back in on that. Thanks a lot.
So I suppose just the general points about maybe turn off your camera and mute yourselves just while the presentations are on. You can ask questions via the hand function, or you can put it directly into chat. And as Anne says, we'll be recording this as well. Thanks very much. So over to yourself, Sinead, for 8 minutes on your thoughts.
Thank you very much, Pádraig, and thank you very much to Professor Scott and her office and NUI Galway and yourself, Pádraig, for the invitation. I was a lecturer. I started my proper lecturing career, I suppose, in NUIG in the law department. So it's fantastic to be back, albeit only virtually, in my office in Dublin. So I hope to get down there physically at some point soon. So I don't have much time, so I'm going to move quickly. Please let me know if you can't see my slides or there's some issue there, but I'm going to take silence as happiness in this scenario. So I want to reflect, as directed by Pádraig and Professor Scott, to reflect on the progress that we've made and maybe some reflections on the opportunities and strategies for moving forward around the consent framework and with the consent framework, and maybe some of the challenges that I've come across myself. So first of all, really, I want to just look at as I said, the critical issues for implementation of the consent framework. And that first point is almost, I could spend the whole time just talking about that first point, and that consent is really a very small word that's trying to do a lot of work in this context. And so in my own research, for example, in socio-legal studies, which looks at law in its cultural context and its social context, consent, the idea of consent, has long been exposed as a very inadequate term. It's not a very useful term, in the sense that it has its roots in ideas of agency and free will that are shaped by the ideal subject of the law. And when we say the law here, we could put in the word regulation as well, more broadly, our society. And historically, the ideal subject of the law has been a middle class white man. And it's not a word that expresses anything about the structural, environmental and interpersonal conditions out of which instances of sexual violence arise. And I think that's really important at the start to say. It ignores, and perhaps for some people it reproduces, gendered inequalities, that are bound up with sexual violence and harassment. So when we think about the word consent, we're always having at the back of our heads the idea that consent is not, in fact, adequate for the purposes that we're using it. It assumes a fully agentic actor who may simply choose if he or she wants to engage in sexual intercourse. And it takes sexuality and gendered constructions of gendered identities out of relationships of power. And of course, as many of us know, this is not the reality for many people, and it's not the reality of sexual violence. What's at the heart of sexual violence and sexual harassment is gender inequality and also issues around communication. So if we look, I'm just going to click onto the next slide in terms of that issue around consent. We see it at the very front of the very first page of the framework. But actually the framework has a longer title. It's about safe, respectful, supportive and positive, ending sexual violence and harassment in Irish HEIs. So right from the start, the group, which I was a member along with Pádraig and Dr Cleona Sadlier from the Rape Crisis Network and others, that actual report that came out in 2019, from the very get-go, we were very clear that it was about much more than the word consent. However, consent is an important, useful term. What we're about is much more than consent. It's about cultural, institutional, and I would suggest personal change as well. So this framework that we were talking about aims to ensure the creation of an institutional campus culture that's safe, respectful, and supportive for students in particular, but also for staff. And it's been developed by this group of which I was part of, and it's been taken up and is a result of, and it has been taken up as well by student activists who are using the word consent in very productive ways to communicate around it. And certainly the group that Pádraig is ahead of, the research group Active Consent, have been, really key to filling out the word consent and talking about things like enthusiastic communication, enthusiastic consent, active consent, and really highlighting that point around communication. So I think, it's a word that we need to be we maintain a critical distance from, but at the same time, remember how useful it is for starting these conversations. And I remember hearing Dr. Cleona Sadlier from the Rape Crisis Network before saying that it is a useful way in to start these conversations and to define boundaries when talking about these issues with young people and indeed older people in the form of staff members. So, what consent means for institutions, and I'm going to come on to governance in a sec, but what it means for institutions is that it's an issue of autonomy, of sexual autonomy, bodily autonomy. It's a matter of equality, and it's a public health issue as well. Mental health and indeed physical health issue as well. For universities, I could say much more, but essentially in a nutshell, there are legal, financial and reputational risks for a university, for any university or any HEI indeed, that fails to take the issue of sexual misconduct seriously, so sexual violence, sexual harassment seriously. And so for institutions, this is where the conversation is at. And it's about adopting best practice. It's about working collaboratively with sector leaders, with academics and with administrative staff and with university and HEI leaders and with the HEI and indeed with the minister to mitigate these risks. So it's a cross-sectoral national approach that's needed, interdisciplinary approach that's needed. And, this is a skeleton of something that of the area that I'm particularly interested in, coming from a law background, but how institutions respond to reports and formal complaints of sexual violence and sexual harassment by staff and by students is key. We're seeing that even today with the recent news coverage around sexual violence and harassment in the military, in the army, and the Curragh. How the institution responds is key to how survivors and how victim survivors understand their own experience, and whether or not they feel recognised or not by the institution is absolutely key to their recovery and also to their sense of how the sense of place, I suppose, in the institution. So that's a skeleton of the procedure that the universities are working on really at the moment. Precautionary measures are a key one, and it's something the Irish Universities Association has been really key in, really flagging that, in fact, universities, HEIs can take precautionary measures short of any full disciplinary procedure being undertaken and pending any disciplinary procedure being taken. And indeed, it's necessary for that to happen. You'll see there I don't have any preliminary examination of a report in that skeleton. Some institutions are talking about that, but that has been shown in the research internationally to be, and indeed in terms of the experience of the HSE, to be basically really, really unhelpful in terms of delaying the procedures and delaying the resolution of the issues, and indeed adding further layers of complexity to an already challenging situation. So I can talk about that more. In terms of policies and procedures, it's a really good idea to have a common staff and student policy. That's what we're working on in Maynooth, for example. There are issues around investigations in relation to data protection, in relation to access to your own data, and in relation to participatory rights. The courts don't want investigations to become mini courts, absolutely not. There's been a Supreme Court decision on that. But there are issues around representation and imbalances of power that need to be worked out. And again, we need to do this in an interdisciplinary way and in a cross-sectoral way. Having a clear policy, though, isn't just about resolutions for victim survivors. It's very clearly about creating a positive institutional culture, a supportive institutional culture. I could say a little bit more about legal cultures, but I'm not going to. I'm going to move on. I'm happy to talk about that in the questions. In terms of accountability, this is something that I think the Minister, in particular, Minister Harris, is taking very seriously. And, he has spoken and worked with the HEA around this. So the HEA's, the Higher Education Authority Centre of Excellence, has been broadened. It's a Centre of Excellence for Gender Equality, and that's broadened out to cover equality, diversion and inclusion, and as well oversight of implementation of this consent framework's implementation. And so it's also been broadened out very clearly to cover staff as well as students. Essentially, in a nutshell, 10% of the allocated block grant that forms part of the strategic dialogue process between an institution and the Higher Education Authority is at stake, or up to 10% is at stake here for universities and higher HEIs. So the annual reporting mechanism that's beginning in September of this year is going to be a really important accountability measure for ensuring that universities don't just engage in rhetoric, but actually really live up to their implementation of the framework. So I know I'm going over time here, so I'm just going to skip to
on about 11, 12 minutes there now.
Oh, sorry. Okay, I'm going to stop talking. That's the end. Yeah, I'm happy to explore the other issues in the chat. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Yeah, really interesting. And, coming from your legal background, but then the more general comments about the use of consent, what it means to different people at different times in different contexts is really interesting as well. Jason, can I call on you now for your thoughts, again, coming from your background?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Pádraig, and thanks for the introduction, the lengthy introduction. And all I can say right back at you is it's just an honour to be involved again here in NUIG. And I just note that Sinead and Pádraig are coming from a background of subject expertise, but I'm afraid I'm not coming from that same background. I don't have the same degree of expertise, but I suppose I'm just going to give some examples in a few slides about the types of things that have happened in UCD by way of example, which I think are aligned to what this national framework is trying to achieve. So if you just bear with me as I just share the slides. So I'm going to start with, the first question was, what are the critical issues for consent framework implementation? And frankly, the critical issues are just so many that I thought I'd just narrow it down to a couple of observations. And the first thing to say is that it's really important that the discussions expanded beyond kind of senior committees and policy development. It's got to be about implementation. Second, the kind of second thing on my list is the need for openness and transparency and building trust. And again, this is something that takes quite a lot of time within institutions, and it's something that can easily go wrong as well. I think having that openness and transparency from the beginning is important, and taking the time from the beginning is important. Not too much time. I think the time is nigh. Certainly many of us have been looking at this now since 2017. HEIs sharing solutions, and I'm aware, for example, that a lot of that sharing has happened through the National Women's Council of Ireland, of which many of us on the call would be part of that group. I know Louise, for example, is joining us today. I know Hayley is joining us today. Aisling O'Grady from UCD is joining us as well. All of these individuals and many more have already been part of that kind of sharing, and that's been really important. And then one thing I might come to at the end very briefly is the how we work out how to make this the part-time responsibility of everybody who needs to be involved, as well as making it the full-time responsibility of somebody, because otherwise the danger there. I'm just going to move myself out the way to move the slide on. So a couple of just brief examples. I think students being involved helps with all of those kind of critical issues. And certainly in UCD, the UCD Students' Union have been involved in very many steps. I've listed them here, but some examples would be that the SU presents a consent video at the beginning of academic orientations alongside program leads. So there the audience is the students, but it's also the kind of the program coordinating team. The Ending Sexual Violence and Harassment Working Group that's been put together in UCD has been used as kind of a student-facing group up until recently, because that's where the initiative had been led from the National Women's Council. That's another really good example of a staff-student collaboration. And again, I think a lot of our institutions will have equivalents. Student leaders are wonderful ambassadors for ending sexual violence and harassment in third level education. So wherever we can, we try and involve them in the development of initiatives. And again, I know that's common amongst all of the institutions represented here today. But I'd say probably it's still not sufficient in that we need to get the conversation also, not just the student leaders and not just the Students' Union, but we need to make sure that all students feel that they're participating in this. And of course, I'm saying that as Dean of Students, so that's my kind of main concern. And an example of what's happened in UCD has been the, as I say, the ESHE internal group, and that was set up in 2017. And although it was student facing at the time, it still actually has some initiatives that I suppose point in the direction of the whole community as well. We did get the endorsement from UMT, and I'd like to just recognise how important the support of the National Women's Council of Ireland was in helping with that first step. Without that, it wouldn't have happened. There are all sorts of external connections as well to reference. And so on the right-hand side of the slide, all the things that are happening, not just this HEA initiative, but all the other initiatives. Looking at the UK and what they're doing, they've given us some really good examples of what we could be doing. And then at the bottom of the slide, the three kind of initiatives that we decided to concentrate on initially was being part of the national movement, as you all are, but also developing the report and support tool and bystander education program. So I've spoken about the report and support tool before, but just very briefly, it's an opportunity for students who don't want to actually bring a complaint, and for staff who don't want to bring a complaint formally forward, to let us know that something has happened, and to help us determine approximately where in the institution, so that we can actually start to think about broad interventions and or slightly more focused interventions. So we bring students to a page like this where we show the mechanism, how the big blue button is reporting anonymously, and there's also all of these other opportunities to understand supports. In addition, and just, we don't have time to go into the detail, but the Q1 report is actually available on the UCD website, and soon the one-year report is available on the website. And relevant to this discussion, for example, at the bottom of this slide, you can see that even in the first quarter, back from last January, there were anonymous reports of 12 instances on the campus. And 9 of those reports included sexual assault or coercive sexual intercourse. Now, and 5 of these 9 were direct reports. That means that 4 individuals appear to be reporting on behalf of somebody else. So that's another thing about about having such a mechanism. And then we also have adopted, with the support of UCC and Louise, a couple of years ago, we developed up a kind of a pilot bystander intervention, which leaned heavily on the Bristol, Fenton, and now Crowley kind of work. And in the first year, it was to a couple of hundred students. Last year, 4,000 UCD students would have taken part in this online as part of their orientation. And it isn't the same doing things online, but it was the best we could all do under COVID. And a big shout out to Aidan Quilty, who is the person who leads that element and is a subject expert in UCD. And the types of feedback that she got for that, we asked people, amongst other questions, to give 5 words to describe the influence of what they were involved in. And they range from, I think, 2,000 responses said informative, but probably the number 9 there is something that I was really pleased to see, which was that it felt, to some at least, that this was empowering, which is certainly what we need to try and achieve. So in short, I would say that those types of initiatives, having an internal team, having an honest reporting or equivalents, for example, the survey that was done was really influential in NUIG. Having bystander training and involving students really cross all of those kind of critical areas. And then finally at that point, the part-time responsibility of many or the full-time responsibility of a few. I can tell you that I've shifted in my view over time, in that we had 15 student advisors trained for disclosure. We've got counsellors, we've got all sorts of other individuals available. We now recognise and are trying to put in place opportunities for some individuals to actually have as their full-time responsibility dealing with this within the university, and that's under consultation. So thank you, Pádraig. I hope it didn't run too far over.
Not at all, Jason. Thank you very much for that. Really interesting, and giving us a sense of the widening and the broadening of the conversation. Yes, as well, the kind of specialization or increased kind of skills needed. Great examples of initiatives there as well, and a lot of kind of practicality, I think. So I'll just move on quickly onto my piece here. So Anne did the scheduling and very wisely put me at the end because she knew then I'd be under time pressure and unable to indulge in my normal habit of going on for too long. So I will try and speed through just the notes that I prepared. So I think, like, talking about the kind of educational programming and the outreach to students and staff, I kind of see this as a social intervention in a college ecology, which is a tongue twister in itself. So in other words, the intervention, it is intended to kind of affect individuals, but really the purpose is, as you know, to be able to reach out to other people around you, your peers, your partner, and all of this is having to happen in a college system that is unused really to incorporating or assimilating that type of programming into its work. Some of the things that we think about in this regard then for the intervention work would be the positive and negative rights. It's summed up there on the cover page of the consent framework document, where it's about the safety and the respect, yet it's also about supportiveness and positivity, as people want obviously to have positive sexual health as well as avoid harm. So from a programming point of view, there's a challenge in itself. The inclusivity, I think, is really interesting as well. So we're currently working on a pilot project with RCSI to expand the inclusivity in terms of gender identity and sexual orientation and ethnic and international background as well. And then for everybody, I suppose, it's as you move through this kind of process as well, you know, we're very aware that, you know, young men have traditionally been harder to reach with this type of work. And so then we look at things like the mainstreaming and getting it right into the middle of the curriculum or the programming for students through orientation to kind of help counter that. Yet at the same time, then you run the risk of people having had a history or a background of assault or harassment, and how to mind everybody. I think it needs to be multi-component. In other words, the one-off workshop, you know, won't do. We can't really say that against all of the kind of cultural flow that, you know, 30 minutes or 60 minutes is enough. And even if you have a substantial amount of time, then, you know, how are you going to develop that conversation over the course of the year and reach the different levels of students and staff that you'll need to do, and then demonstrate that it's been worthwhile, or demonstrate learning, what's working, what's not working as well. So the types of points that I'm getting at here are around scalability. How would we kind of approach that, you know, very promising prospect of trying to reach all students, all staff in a sustainable way? And then ownership, and the word that's obscured there is leadership, is critical there. So we're talking about designing interventions, educational programs, and so forth, to be engaging, to be impactful at the individual or the group level. But all of this is happening in a very complex organizational environment. Just borrowed from Ross Woods here some slides that he reported on over the past number of months about the uptake from colleges with regard to some of the targets in the consent framework. So for example, up at the top, you can see the green is biggest there for the institutional working groups haven't been set up, or for the workshops and classes having started. So that's really good news. But again, we return to the point that we're in a complex organization. So you're also going to need the backup of policies. Sinead has mentioned the need to do that. The difficulty that colleges have sometimes approaching that, knowing what is the right thing to do in that regard. So there's much less green light there. The education plan for staff, which is underneath it, again, there's very little green light there to show that the staff planning and education, which I think is vital in order to have sustainable change, has taken place as yet. We've concentrated a lot this year on that. And then in terms of measuring effectiveness as well, I think there's considerable work there. Well, if we look at one of the bright spots from Ross's graph, then, you know, we've been very busy and active ourselves. We reached 16,000 first-year students across the country with the online workshop, which we regard as stage 1 of a student education program. Stage 2 being an e-learning module, 45 minutes of your time to engage with some of our data and findings, trying to really put it in context of the sexual experiences survey findings proactively in terms of the kinds of skills that you might want to have. And then the ongoing online programming, social media type programming, to keep the conversation alive, to target crunch areas and critical issues right throughout the year, and to target both staff and students in this regard. So this is something that we spent a lot of time on over the course of this year, and we will be doing right throughout 2021, which is looking at the staff members. So again, this would be an area that, you know, needs a lot of cultivation and development. As you saw, there's been a lot of development on outreach to students, much less so really in terms of staff. And the way that we're looking at it would be all staff need awareness. So, you know, a short video, the kind of health and safety training kind of information we tend to see on certain topics. Many staff are in a position of influence. They head a unit, an academic program, their registrar, etc. in a college. So they are in a position to pull the levers of change. So we don't necessarily want to train them up as consent workshop facilitators, but we do want to engage their support very actively in the change process. So that's a different type of engagement with staff. And then the training for some staff, as Jason very usefully points out, then the kind of emergence of people who are finding this within their job role, and the type of training needs then that they're going to have. We've done a lot of work on that this year. So here in this graph, we're seeing the idea of the both positive and negative rights and how the broadest kind of conception of consent then is trying to address both aspects for different reasons, because I think one of the reasons that we have traditionally focused on positive sexual health and sexual health promotion with consent workshops is because that's nearly the safest thing to do with first-year students. It's the least threatening thing to do. It opens up a conversation, but then we do leave all of the issues around awareness of sexual assault, harassment, and rape that also need to be addressed. And they are quite complex issues there in terms of gender, sexual orientation, campus culture, and so forth. So it is a broad canvas, I think, as well. Sinead has made that point that we're trying to manage. So this is just distilled from the e-learning module that we've launched this year. But again, we would find, you know, in one way you can get the first year online workshop, embed it, but now we definitely need to embed the further steps that I've mentioned. And so, you know, we'll be tending to look at this ecological model then. This is the bigger picture, and it coincides, it's not coming out of the blue. It is the kind of tone and feel, I think, that we had in the consent framework document, which is the graphic on the right-hand side, talking about the targeted initiatives for staff and students. But then that really is going to sit on top of a policy structure and is equally going to sit in the midst of an institutional culture. So we tend to look at that. This is our theory of change that we use with the active consent program. So equally with an eye on young people and on institutions. And then when we design an intervention, then we're trying to have it based on theory, but ensure it's acceptable, that it's feasible, it's effective, and then tell people about it, basically. The social media side of things, you may have seen on the 1st of March, we launched an 8-week campaign called Start Here, a social media campaign. You can check out the USI website there, are running a lot of the practical end of things for us on that through a collaboration that we have with them there. And then in terms of the staff training, coming back to these issues that I was talking about for awareness for all, education for many, and training for some, these are some of the things that we're doing at the moment. So there are big issues to kind of tackle and topics to kind of grapple with. But I think it's with the kind of backdrop of the consent framework that we're able to approach these things. Okay, so that's my bit. And I think we would go over to questions now to see how we can engage with our participants in the seminar. So earlier I was talking about issues like, you know, what are the reasonable boundaries? Are we maximizing all the opportunities that we have in the college environment? What are the biggest challenges? How do we engage people who are going to help us with the process of cultural change? Are there untapped opportunities? And what about the whole staff experience as well? But equally, I'd throw it over to the group just to see if there are particular questions that people would like to put to us at this stage. So Sharon, could you just elaborate a little bit on that question there? Unless Jason or Sinead, can he?
Maybe while Sharon is doing that, Pádraig, I might kind of just ask for a quick response to, or a quick comment from maybe Jason and Sinead in particular. What do you think the key actions that, you know, university management teams or institutional senior management teams can do to help, I guess, support and embed the necessary responses to the consent framework, etc., in an institution?
Do you want me to go first, Sinead? Is that okay? I mean, one thing that is often thought about is that somehow the kind of management teams would want to embrace the kind of the solutions. And as you've seen from the presentations, the reality is that well, certainly largely the reality is that it's an unescapable truth, and to not deal with the matter actually is going to cause many more problems. And certainly in 2017, there was no barrier to kind of forming a group. There was no barrier to participating. And now I don't see any barrier to putting in place the resources, but we are kind of still living this development, and it remains to be seen how they get fleshed out over time. So I do think that obviously resources is one, and making sure that there is support and money put in to those resources, such that it isn't seen to be the continued part-time job of a few, but it's actually becomes a real responsibility for some who become accountable and responsible in a way that has been difficult to identify in the past. I guess I think that's probably the key from my point of view. Oh, and role modeling. It's really important that the management, whether they're senior management, middle management, are seen to be actually behaving in a way which is supportive of these initiatives, whether that be engaging in training, for example. That's a type of thing that if you see that your managers are doing the training, you might be more convinced that this is something you should do also. So role modeling, I think, is another quick win.
Yeah, thanks very much. It's a very pertinent question. The first thing I would say on a practical level is to say that we should have a VP for, as you have in Galway and Maynooth indeed, and many other universities, but not all universities and not all HEIs, to have a VP for equality, diversity, inclusion, to have somebody at the table and the university executive with that level of responsibility and accountability is really important, that it sits within one particular office. And I think it works well within that office, because if we're looking at issues relating to staff as well as students, then it's analogous to bullying and harassment. So it works well, I think, in terms of governance structures. It doesn't belong in the registrar's office. It doesn't belong in HR. It belongs, I think, in the VPs. But not every university has that person. So anyway, that's one thing to think about. The other one is to really engage with the cultural change that's being demanded, really, by the minister and by the sector leadership. So in terms of the HEA, what they're looking for is no longer to rely on silence from survivors. And I think even if you look at the Me Too movement, or you look at cultural shifts in the last couple of years, even in Ireland, institutions are being held to account so much more. We began with child sexual abuse in the 90s, 80s and 90s, with lone figures really coming, or brave people speaking up, and now this is all part of the same thing. And I think universities have settled cases and have relied on non-disclosure agreements too heavily, and they've relied on conservative approaches to the law that are not necessarily even in accordance with the legal duties required of universities. So I think there's a need to engage with the duties under the Employment Equality Act and the Equal Status Act, and indeed the Constitution and the European Convention as well. So there are new legal strategies required, and SMTs need to engage with them.
I think that those are very, very useful, very valid points from everybody. I think on the part of the colleges and maybe staff, and I see, Sharon, you were talking about buy-in, really. I suppose from my point of view, I try and take an optimistic point of view and say, look, staff haven't been approached on this with a range of, educational outreach activities, or, do the people in the leadership of HEIs always kind of fully appreciate all the nuances and what some of the solutions are? Because sometimes if it appears like it's a problem that we're bringing, where's the solutions, that may be easier for people to ignore. So I think I would definitely say we're in an absolutely vital period. From Ross's point there about most colleges seem to be involved in the uptake of the student education, but I think what we're all saying is we have maybe a very narrow window of time to figure out how to reach staff. And I think our first observation would be, as Sinead as well as saying in the chat, reaching academic staff. There's been limited engagement over the years there, but let's try reaching people at the different levels. What we always say with students is meet people where they are. And I think some academics as well, they might have kind of personal concerns. I don't know enough. I don't even know myself what the support systems are, or the reporting systems are in the college, who's going to back me up on this, and so forth. So that's the thinking that went into these different levels of engaging staff that we've been thinking about and hoping to roll out now over the next number of months.
Can I just come in on that for a second? Just the other thing that strikes me from Sinead's comment is that the anonymous reporting data became useful and is remaining useful for having conversations that are now at the level of either the college or some level greater than simply the EDI unit level. And now heads of school and heads of college and student representatives are beginning to come around the table to look at the data that's specific to their area. And actually, it's not just the data, because I think actually that diminishes the impact. Those types of reports, there's a narrative associated with them which is really powerful, and it's really difficult actually to not buy in when you read a story, even if it's just a collection of phrases that somebody has selected in a drop-down list of something that happened to them, and you know that it's somebody within your area. You don't know who it is, but you know it's happening. I think it really, helps with the buy-in question, and it deals with that issue of, oh, well, it doesn't, it's not happening here. It's not something that I've ever seen, and it also then exposes the conversation to that wider audience, allows for the supports to get discussed and disseminated. So it's beginning to, it's still early days, I have to say, but it's beginning to have that type of helpful aspect to it as well. That and training, I think, will be really important. I think you've referenced that already.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's interesting, because you're talking about the kind of relatable kind of cases, and you can kind of start to visualize and empathize. And I know last year then we found the kind of blunt instrument of the statistics, etc., seemed to kind of provoke movement as well. So it's interesting that we do have a range of strategies like that. And then sometimes people feel insecure. What are you trying to make me do? So that's where having the clear lines of action. I think it's really interesting as well. Everybody in all the different colleges nationally would have engaged in a lot of action planning over the past few months now, because of the requirement from the HEA to put forward an action plan. So it augurs well in that case, because people have had to sit down and think this through. So it'll be really interesting to see what develops over the next number of months. And as Trasa is mentioning to us as well, like this time next year, like most colleges will be able to reap the benefits of this as something similar, Jason, to what you have with the report and support. So that anonymous reporting kind of facility should be available in other colleges. And it's about all the community then maybe ensuring that we can kind of harness that for the right type of change, rather than people kind of feeling threatened.
Just to reference Lynn, or I should always reference Lynn Foster, who's a colleague of mine that sits on that group, and it's great to see that development, and we would love to be part of that as well, because we've experienced what it's like a little bit earlier. We've certainly got some learnings, shall we call it, to bring to the table for what can and can't be done. So it is an important development, and it becomes even more important when you see the data at a national level, as we did recently, for example, with the tool that you helped to launch yourself, the survey that you helped to launch and run yourself.
Maybe there's something in it as well with kind of the lack of maybe case studies like that. I think people would be looking at UCD and what you've been doing and try and learn from that. There probably is more kind of integration of everybody's experience that might be helpful. I think as well, Sinead, like one of the issues that people do feel a bit exposed on is around policy, and because policy leads into legal ramifications. Have you found that to be, how do colleges approach that type of conversation? Are they at the point where they know they have to engage, or is there still some reservation, Sinead?
My impression from speaking to various people is that there's two things going on. One is that there's a real willingness to engage, and I think there's a recognition that there are serious reputational implications for not acting. But I think there's still some way to go in terms of transparency around processes, and in terms of really, there's so much that can be done in terms of publishing outcomes, communicating with parties. There's so much that can be done across the whole sector in relation to how procedures are designed. And it's not easy. I'm not trying to say it's easy, but it's also something that employment lawyers have extensive experience in, and they are getting it. They are getting that fact that there is a cultural shift now, and that it's not enough to simply say, we'll just settle out of court and there'll be an NDA and no one will ever know. Which has been used by every one of the universities in Ireland, as far as I can tell. And so either people will just won't sign them, or they're going to break them and take the hit, And so there's a real need, I think, to really engage with current legal research on this area. So it's probably the best way I can put it. But there is a real desire, I think, on the part of people in leadership to do this right. They don't want to get it wrong. They also, though, and it's not out of any desire to be to not recognise survivors. People are legitimately concerned and interested in the position of the university. So I'm not trying to say these things are straightforward, but I think greater education, perhaps by people like me, and Louise Crowley's done a lot of work around this as well, around just the legal duties and obligations that are on institutions, around things like health and safety, risk management, and here's where precautionary measures really kick in. And also around Employment Equality Acts and Equal Status, the Equal Status Act, and indeed the public sector duty. I think lawyers and survivors advocates are going to become more conversant with those provisions, let's just say.
Thanks, Sinead. And I see your camera coming on, Anne, so I get a sense of where we're at with the discussion. But I also note Yvonne's comment about sectoral spokespeople, because it's interesting as we think about reaching out to staff, which of the student strategies, because we'd often think about, students' voice, being relayed back to students themselves as an effective means of communication. So maybe we should be thinking about staff spokespeople as well. But I'm thinking, Anne, you might have had slightly other issues on your mind as we reach this point.
Thank you very much, Pádraig. You can read me like a book. I guess really, colleagues, we unfortunately need to bring this session to a close because of time issues and ongoing commitments. But can I really express my thanks to the panelists for their excellent input this morning, and Pádraig, my thanks also for doing an excellent job in drawing out the best, I think, of the conversation. I think also in NUI Galway, we would like to thank our colleagues in the Galway Crisis Centre, who have been excellent collaborators with us for a number of years and have sat on our working group really actively since January 2019, and I know have fed into both the student and staff education programme. So I think that's a really important support to us from their area of expertise. I think picking up on some of the comments Sinead has made more laterally there, it was very interesting to hear her talking about the requirement for new strategies, new approaches from UMT, new understanding, I guess, of the law. And I think, to be fair, my colleague in UCD, whom Jason would know very well, Colin Scott, talks about this as a required cognitive shift. And I think he's quite right. I think we do require a cognitive shift in terms of dealing with this matter appropriately and in a way that is supportive of both our staff and student body. So to draw it to a close, thank you all very much for attending. Thank you particularly to panelists for your really important input and active participation this morning. Jason, I know you've given greatly of your time to us. This is your second visit, at least, to us on this kind of topic area, so really appreciate that. And just encourage people to pop into the rest of our programme for this week if they have the time to do so. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thanks, Sinead.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.